Hello, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Meter, an MPSC podcast. I'm your host, Mike Byrne. Today, I am fortunate to be joined by all three commissioners, Chair Dan Scripps, Commissioner Catherine Peritic, and Commissioner Alessandra Carrion. Good day. It's good to see you all. Today, we have an exciting topic in store for you. We're going to talk about rate cases. It's kind of a core element of what we do here at the commission. So maybe I'll start off, Chair Scripps, with the question, what is a rate case?
Sure. It really is in some ways the bread and butter of what we do here. They're the cases that typically get the most attention. And it's because it directly affects both people's pocketbooks and ultimately the resources that are available to the utilities to invest in the infrastructure that we all rely on. And so really at its most fundamental, the utility comes up with how much it believes it needs to invest in the system, as well as the operations and maintenance of that system, and then how much it's likely to receive from customers under its current rates. And if there's a gap there, that the amount needed for investment in operations and maintenance outstrips the amount that it's going to get in rates under the current rates, then it can submit to the commission a proposal to increase those rates. And that's really what we look at is whether or not there is in fact a gap. And there's a lot that goes into that, including sales forecasts and a whole lot of other things to try and calculate how much money we think that the utility is likely to get from its customers, and then whether the proposed investments ultimately are necessary, they're reasonable, they're prudent, they sort of check all the boxes that we need to look at. But those cases come to us on a fairly regular basis, as I think most listeners know, and really is one of the core functions of the commission to consider whether or not the proposal is in fact reasonable and should be adopted in some form.
So, thank you for that explanation. I think that sort of begs the question, how do you go about determining rates? How are rates determined? And maybe Commissioner Carrion, I'll ask you that question.
Sure. So, like everything the commission does, our rate determination process is as established by statute. So the rates are determined through we say semi-judicial, but highly legal process that requires that the cost must be reasonable and prudent, and that utilities must have the opportunity to earn a fair profit. And that necessarily requires that we're considering the utility and its shareholders, but ultimately our role is to also ensure that we are considering the customer, throughout every step of the rate case. And the process behind how we determine the rates also has, a series of steps and a timeline, again, sort of as determined by statute.
Maybe it would be helpful to dig into that process a little bit. And Commissioner Peritic, maybe you could tell us about how the rate case process works.
Yeah, so as Commissioner Carrion just mentioned, a lot of this is determined by statute. So the legislature has determined that we are allowed 10 months to review these rate cases. The utilities will file a rate case, and then that starts the timer of a 10-month process for us at the commission to then review everything that's on that record, all of the positions of all of the parties, and then make a final determination and issue an order that then holds the utility to whatever is written in that order. And 10 months might sound like a lot. It did to me before I joined the commission, actually. I thought 10 months, this is no problem. We got this. That's plenty of time. It turns out these are very large cases that have a lot of moving parts and a lot of different parties and a lot of different opinions that all need to be considered. So there's the utility that submits their case, and that in and of itself is hundreds of pages, just the initial application. And then our staff at the commission, which we talked a little bit about on the first episode, the staff that we have here, around, yes, absolutely, around 200 staff who participate in each one of the rate cases. And so they review that application that the utility submits and put their opinions on the record, in a written format on the record for everybody to be able to see. And then there are other parties who then intervene as well or participate in the rate case as well. Sometimes it's just a few if it's a relatively small utility. Other times it's very many. In the last rate case that we just issued last week or the week before, that rate case, it was a DTE rate case, had 28 different parties to that case. So there are 28 different opinions on the record of what we should do.
What
So-
kind of parties? Like, are there typical parties who would intervene?
Yeah, there are. So the Attorney General is a party who intervenes very frequently, and then there are lots of other groups as well. So groups representing businesses, groups representing different customer classes, groups representing different residential customers, groups of residential customers. There's many different types of parties to the cases, and I think the number and variety of parties is increasing too. We're seeing more and more people being interested in these rate cases and putting their positions on the record so that we can consider them. So once that all of that testimony is submitted and we have all of this on the record, that's when we start reviewing it. And we read through all of those different positions, and we have some advising staff to be able to help us with this, and a group of attorneys who helps us with this as well. And we do dozens of hours of formal deliberations with the three of us, talking through each one of these issues, along with advice from all of our advisors and our staff members and our attorneys. And we read through the transcripts that are on the record. We sift through the tables of data, read the explanations and justifications of the arguments for both for and against each one of those issues. And there's a lot of issues. Again, in this most recent rate case that we just issued, there were 318 different decisions just in one rate case that we needed to decide. 318 different things. These range from very small to very large. So we have to make each one of those decisions, and then it gets written up in an order, and then that order is issued in one of those public commission meetings that you see where we all vote on whether or not to approve that order, which then makes it legally binding.
That's amazing. There's so much that goes into it, and that 10 months goes by pretty quickly once you're looking at all those different steps. So I guess we can go in a couple different directions here. I think one thing that's of interest to me is you talked about the different parties in the case. And in bigger cases, I think that there tend to be more parties, more issues. That can complicate things in terms of having to do more work in that compressed time frame. But I also imagine that having more evidence on the record can help to make for stronger decisions at the end of the day. Chair Scripps, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I really do think, I'll take the complexity because of that. It is a challenge. The 10-month deadline is every single day sort of counts, and as you're going through that. And I'd also note that under Michigan law, if we fail to issue a decision within that 10 months, then the utility gets the rate proposal it asked for as filed. So there is a really significant driver to get all of that work done. And adding additional issues, additional decision points, 318 in the most recent DTE cases, Commissioner Paratek just said, all of that sort of forces more work, and the more parties that are involved in those, the more complex the record is. But it also, the richer the record is. And that's why I think it really has been beneficial, the work to try and expand the opportunity for different parties to participate. When you go back, 20 years ago, it was a relatively small number of parties in the case, and really sort of people had specific roles, and the Attorney General was in, and maybe large industrial customers, and then our staff, and that was about it. And one of the things that's happened since then is the creation of something called the Utility Consumer Participation Board, which administers a fund called the Utility Consumer Participation Fund, and that provides grants to organizations representing the interests of residential customers, really trying to get the folks who are paying the bills each month involved in the process in a formal way, and giving them the resources to hire experts and attorneys and participate in this sort of quasi-judicial process that Commissioner Carrion was describing. And the result has been we've gotten a large and growing number of those groups, that we have organizations, community-based organizations that are made up of customers who have often sort of not been front and center in the Commission's decisions. And having those perspectives in mind, trying to strike the balance that Commissioner Carrion was describing between the interests of the company and its investors and the need to get that capital and make those investments in a system that we increasingly rely on for every facet of our day-to-day activities, but also keeping in mind that there are customers at the end of the day who need to sort of be able to pay those bills, and having that those interests, those voices formally represented through the process, I think gives us a deeper sense of the issues involved and ultimately a better and more thorough set of evidence to ultimately base our decisions on.
And I think that, I totally agree that we're getting more and more public participation, which is fantastic. But I think that the work that we do is still relatively obscure, is one word that I saw in an article recently.
Yep.
Another phrase that I saw in an article recently was, quote, completely unknown to the public. And another one was cloaked in arcane language. And then there was the Bill McKibben quote recently, who said that public utility commissions are protected by a force field of their own boringness.
I think you meant that as a compliment.
I hope so. But I think that that's really starting to change. Mm-hmm. And I think that we really are seeing an increase in interest in the work that we're doing because it is so important, and we're seeing more people realize how important this work is. And even just having these articles written that are saying, talking about, like, trying to open up that process and trying to bring some clarity into the work that happens at public service commissions is really valuable. And, I want to encourage anybody who has an interest in the work that we do to participate and to either formally through participation with one of these groups on the record as an intervener, or informally. We take public comment at every single one of our commission meetings, where you can come and talk to us about anything that's in a case or anything that you want us to hear, or that we have a public comment option on the record as well, where you can submit a public comment through our e-dockets system. So if you want to make a written comment, you can submit it there too. So we do really appreciate and read through those comments as part of our work.
I will say, and you described this already, Commissioner Paratig, it's equally important to emphasize, though, how much not only we adhere, but need to adhere to the very complex legal process behind rate cases, such that public comments are critical inputs in terms of providing us with more insight. But for the proceeding itself, as you already indicated, everything we decide is as based on the evidentiary record. It's what the witnesses filed in their testimony that then we ultimately use to decide those 300 plus decision-making points. So I think I completely agree. It's so critical. Well, one, it's already happening. The public is more interested in, more aware of our work, and I think that's wonderful. And so when someone chooses to engage, I think it is a good point to make that there's that formal process of, if you're intervening and what you file on the record ultimately will get in front of us to make a decision on. That's part of the formal rate case proceeding. But if you have a comment, you could file a public comment on virtually anything we're doing at the commission. We have so many ways for the public to engage in that informal process, as you said as well, like between our commission meetings, but we also have a number of work groups, and we have an entire team dedicated to outreach across the state. So I always make sure that that's very clear to set the expectation that our legal process literally follows the statute that we are required to follow to sort of ensure that we adjudicate on these cases within the 10-month time frame, but that ultimately public comment also has kind of a unique role that doesn't make its way onto the evidentiary record.
So wherever you're getting this podcast, we will make sure that there's an ability for you to link to how to comment in any of our cases. We'll include that as part of this. And I think you've all talked about sort of the tight time frames, the complexity associated with these cases, and sort of there is kind of a high barrier to entry for just an individual who has an interest in trying to find a way to participate. I think the commission has acknowledged that and has been working to find ways to address that over time. So probably both within the rate case process, but in terms of the work that we're doing more generally. I know there's a couple of proceedings that are open right now that are looking at some of these issues. I don't know if one of you would like to talk a little bit about sort of what we're seeing there and maybe what to expect in months and years to come.
So one of the things that came out of the 2023 energy reforms that were enacted at the end of that year was a requirement that we initiate two proceedings, one on rate case processes and the other on opportunities to expand public participation. And as my colleagues have said, this is something that is ongoing. We've been seeing growth in public participation sort of organically over the last decade, and then I think more intentionally really coming out of COVID and how to engage during that weird time, but rolling forward and as we were able to start getting around the state more. So we held our first formal commission meeting outside of Lansing a couple years ago in the city of Detroit. We've since replicated that in Grand Rapids and in Escanaba, trying to do more, including as the opportunities to gather public input on the changes that took place in the 2023 energy laws. So in 2024 held public hearings around the state on different facets of that, one in Detroit, one in Marquette, one in Flint, and then the public hearing again in Grand Rapids. So it's really been fairly intentional to try and get out of Lansing and get into communities around the state. And I think that will continue. But looking at opportunities to improve public participation in our cases as a whole, and then what do we need to do in the rate case context specifically to make sure that we're breaking down some of those barriers to entry and really trying to get a sense of the issues that matter to customers as we're considering these large investments in the underlying electric and gas systems.
So I've heard a lot today about sort of the legal process that the commission employs and is bound to employ by the statutes that lay all of this out. And I'm aware of standards like just and reasonable rates or reasonable and prudent costs. I wonder if someone can talk a little bit about sort of how those standards come into play in terms of the decision making that's going on when it comes to looking at a rate case.
Sure. Well, so that's how we have to evaluate each one of those decisions. I mentioned that there were 318 individual decisions in the last rate case. We need to look at each one of those individual decisions and decide, is that a reasonable and prudent investment or a reasonable and prudent action for the utility to take? And is that a reasonable and prudent amount of money too, right? Like sometimes we might think that the action itself is a good idea, but that the dollar figure attached to that action is not correct. So we can adjust that too and make sure that piece is reasonable and prudent. So what we do is we actually look at the record, look at the testimony, listen to the cross-examination. We dig into each one of the any tables or evidence that's presented alongside each one of the requests that the utility is making, and we compare all of that with any of the parties that have submitted additional support for their arguments on the record, and then decide which of those pathways is the most reasonable and prudent. And that's how we will ultimately make that decision. And that's a standard that we have in Michigan is reasonable and prudent. In different states, it can be slightly different than that.
And part of, I think, the work that you end up doing, like if you're going through each of those decisions, what you should end up with is a rate that is just and reasonable, and one that is then in effect for the public. I think we hear that sort of these rate cases or the rates change quite a bit. Like, how often are rate cases filed, and what does that mean?
It goes back to statute again, that utilities are allowed to file a rate increase no sooner than 2 months after the last case was finalized. And so if you have, doing the math, and I should turn to my engineer colleagues on this one, but even I can do this part. If it's 10 months to do a rate case and then they've got to wait 2 months, they can file essentially annually. And, there are pros and cons to that, certainly. Part of it is based on, again, going back to statute, the fact that in Michigan, we don't require, but allow for the utilities to use what's called a forward test year. And so they're not necessarily just looking backwards at what they've spent and recouping that, but the legislature has said, to allow for pre-recovery of some of these costs, that they can look forward and say, what do we expect to spend over the year ahead, and get that baked into rates ahead of time. I think that ultimately results in more frequent filing because they're only looking 1 year ahead. It's not sort of looking sort of 10 years ahead, and what do we need to get through that time. We do have other processes, including distribution plans, that look at sort of 5-year investments and try and provide additional context in terms of the longer term vision and planning for the utilities. But ultimately, the rate cases use a 1 year forward test year, and as a result, I think they're coming in more frequently. One of the other considerations is then when they do apply for a rate increase, what does that mean in terms of a percentage increase for customers? And this is a place that cuts both ways. There's obviously concerns that if they're filing every year, that means they get an increase every year. But when you look at a utility that stays out for 5 years, sometimes the increases are more dramatic, and that you're sort of rolling in all 5 years of additional investment into a single case, as opposed to taking smaller bites each year that are maybe more in line with inflationary increases. And so there's pros and cons on both sides. I think there's broad frustration that utilities file as often as they do, but again, they're allowed to under the law. In some ways, the framework that the legislature has adopted almost encourages them to, and it means that typically they're smaller increases than if they were to stay out 5 or 7 years and then try and catch up all at once.
Certainly, in a period of sort of ongoing and necessary investment, I mean, there definitely are trade-offs that need to be made there.
Yeah.
So this has been an amazing conversation. I want to maybe finish up by giving each of you an opportunity to, if there's one thing you could say to the public about rate case decisions, what might it be? And so Commissioner Paratic, I'll start with you.
Sure, thanks, Mike. I think I'd say that we're looking out for the public. That's truly the heart of our job. We take that job to protect the public very seriously, and I think that you see that with my description of everything that we do to go through this rate case. The many dozens of hours of deliberations, hundreds of hours of reading for each one of the rate cases. This is every year for every utility that files. We go into so much minute detail to ensure that the utilities are spending the money on the things that are going to provide the most benefit to customers, and that each one of those dollars is a reasonable and prudent expenditure that we feel comfortable requiring all of the customers of this utility to pay for. We want, and then also ultimately to make sure that the money actually goes into those projects and actually is spent on those projects. And I will say that we're actually starting to see some success in the work that we've been doing over the years too. Our reliability has increased in the last few years for our two largest utilities for 2024, and then also in the wind and ice storms that we've seen at the beginning of this year too. We've seen very few outages as a result of those. Which I think is a really big step forward and a lot of progress. So I'm just encouraged to see that our efforts really are starting to make a difference.
That's great. Commissioner Carrion?
Yeah, I think if I could choose something to sort of end with too, and it's a little wonkier in the weeds, but I think it's a good distinction to make, which is that while we have the authority to regulate rates and we are guided by the reasonable and prudent standard, we still cannot make business management decisions for the utilities. So certainly while we have the authority to set these rates, I just want to clarify for listeners who may not be aware, that does not necessarily mean that behind the scenes we can tell utilities what to do with the money they earn. And I think that's just a consideration, especially as there's more awareness around public utility commissions across the country, what our role actually is and the confines of our role and how we operate. Even something like saying just and reasonable doesn't have a formula attached to it. So our decision making and our authority, again, as determined by statute, allows us and affords us to have a very real and major impact, but it does not mean that we are working to determine then where the utility or that company sort of decides to allocate the funding that we've approved.
Maybe I want to pick up on something that both my colleagues said, and then I'll offer one other one. So, because it sounds like there's a tension there, right? That we're looking at each individual line item, and then at the end of the day, the utility still has the discretion to move stuff around, and there's I would say frustration sometimes in terms of how that plays out, because the phrase is that we set rates but not budgets, but in setting rates, we have to go, because we don't have really any other way to do it, look line by line and, okay, is this, particularly in a forward test year environment where we're looking at what they're proposing to spend in the year ahead, is this the right project, and then to Commissioner Paratek's, the right amount for that project, and then are they actually going to spend it? And so it's a series of 318 decisions that ultimately get rolled up into one rate that they ultimately get, and then that gets divided among their customers, but that they get to charge. And so there is this sort of inherent tension between how we do our jobs on a line-by-line basis, and then at the end of the day that it really gets rolled up, and with some important exceptions around things where we've ring-fenced the dollars specifically, a fair amount of flexibility by the utility to then spend those dollars sort of in the year ahead in the ways that they sort of deem most appropriate, and then a chance to do it all over again a year after that. But maybe the last thing I'll say is the difference between rates and bills. And rates get a lot of attention, and deservedly so, but there's essentially almost an inverse relationship between the rates that are charged and the actual usage in a system. And that can be both because if you're charging more, you're probably going to use less. There's sort of a natural result for that. But also that if you're spreading the fixed costs of a system across fewer kilowatt hours sold or decatherms on the gas side, then the rate for each one of those units is going to be higher for the same fixed cost. But that doesn't mean that the bills automatically go up in the same amount. And through things like energy waste reduction and a number of other things, our bills are really sort of middle of the pack in Michigan. And so it's, I think, an important distinction to try and draw that as we're looking at rate increases, that doesn't necessarily have a corresponding increase in bills, that if our rates are high, that bills are high. Our rates are higher because we typically sell fewer kilowatt hours to pay for the cost of the whole system. But again, the bills that customers pay are really sort of middle of the pack, both when you look at other states in the Midwest and then nationally. So I think we got to keep both in mind and think about how one affects the other. But there is a difference, and at the end of the day, people pay bills, not necessarily rates, and that's an important distinction to keep in mind.
Thank you for making that point, and thanks to all of you for spending time with us today to talk through these really important issues, the decisions that you all make that are supported by, the evidentiary record and all the parties that participate in those cases. They affect the lives of all Michigan residents, the livelihoods of businesses throughout the state. So really important work. Fascinating discussion. I can't imagine how anybody would ever say that this is boring work. It's really exciting.
Here's the force field.
So again, we're gonna wrap up our third episode of Behind the Meter. Appreciate all of you following along, and encourage you to jump in again. We will put some resources in the links below, and look forward to spending time with you again in the future. Thanks.